The chandeliers above the sky domes shimmered like captured constellations, spilling their fractured light across a sea of crystal glass and silk. New York had never glowed so brightly, nor had it ever felt so cold beneath its brilliance. Tonight was the unveiling of the Crystal Tower, a monument to ambition, glass, and impossible dreams. The building stood like a shard of heaven piercing the city skyline, and inside its ballroom, 1,000 guests floated through the glow of champagne and cello strings, whispering names that mattered. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel Hale, tall, elegant, impossibly composed. The city's favorite mogul, a man whose charm could make investors forgive disasters and journalists forget their pens. Cameras adored him. Spotlights chased him like loyal pets. His tuxedo gleamed beneath the chandeliers as he lifted a glass to toast the night. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman the city had not yet learned to name, Ava LaRue, with golden hair swept into an artful knot and a smile that balanced perfectly between innocence and possession. Her dress clung to her like light. When she leaned in to whisper in Nate's ear, it looked effortless, intimate, inevitable. Their laughter carried just far enough to be heard, the kind that turned heads and tightened throats. The crowd responded with that particular brand of admiration reserved for the powerful. Admiration laced with envy. The orchestra swelled. Flashbulbs flared. Waiters glided through the crowd like ghosts in tailored black. The world was in perfect balance, at least until the music stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was the sound of air collapsing, a bow slipping off a string, a silence heavy enough to make the chandeliers tremble. Heads turned, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the glittering assembly. At the top of the staircase, framed by glass and light, Elena Cruz stood. She didn't belong to the moment. She defined it. Her gown was cut in clean architectural lines, black satin flowing like ink poured over marble. No jewelry, no smile, just the stillness of a woman who had designed the very building they were celebrating and had been erased from its story. For one suspended heartbeat, no one breathed. Then whispers rose like wind among the crowd. That's her, the engineer, the wife. Elena descended the stairs slowly, every step deliberate, as if measuring the weight each would leave on the polished floor. She had built this tower, every joint, every curve, every secret of glass and steel. It was her language written in geometry, her soul translated into structure. And yet, tonight, her husband stood in the center of her creation with another woman on his arm. Nate's smile faltered. His hand, still resting on Ava's back, stiffened. The cameras turned. Flash, flash. The entire ballroom became a theater, and they were all actors forced into their roles without rehearsal. Elena, someone whispered near the champagne table, but she didn't hear, or perhaps she chose not to. Her gaze found Nate's across the room, a collision of history and disbelief. His expression flickered between panic and composure, between love once remembered and betrayal made public. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was architecture, solid, calculated, unyielding. As she reached the marble floor, the orchestra hesitated, unsure whether to continue. 1,000 faces watched her cross the room, like the ghost of a truth too inconvenient to bury. Even Ava, radiant and self-assured moments ago, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of that silence. Elena passed them without pausing. She brushed by Nate so closely that the scent of her perfume, amber and smoke, lingered in his breath long after she was gone. And when she looked at Ava, there was no hatred in her eyes, only understanding, the kind that hurts more than fury ever could. Because love doesn't always die in fire. Sometimes it freezes mid-motion, beautiful, perfect, and lifeless. Elena walked to the glass wall that faced the skyline. Beyond it, the city glittered like a field of broken stars. The tower's reflection rippled faintly against the night, a ghostly image of everything she had built. Her pulse matched the rhythm of the lights, steady, mechanical, unfeeling. Someone behind her murmured her name again. The music resumed, softer now, as if afraid to intrude. The crowd exhaled in relief, pretending the rupture hadn't happened, pretending the gala was still flawless. But Elena knew better. She had spent her life designing structures that could survive any pressure. Yet here, in her own creation, she could feel the cracks forming. invisible but unstoppable. And for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about physics or design or the way light refracted through tempered glass. She was thinking about fault lines, the kind that run through people. A waiter passed. She took a glass of champagne, lifted it slightly toward her reflection in the window, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, not even to herself. "Here's to what breaks quietly." Then she drank. The night carried on as if nothing had changed, but the air had shifted. The room had seen something it couldn't unsee, a truth shimmering beneath the polish. Somewhere deep in the steel bones of the building, something unseen trembled, and the city, unaware of the storm it was about to witness, kept glittering. If stories like this move you, if you've ever stood in a room full of light and felt invisible, stay close. There are more nights to come, more secrets to unfold, more hearts to rebuild. Like, comment, and follow to keep walking with Elena Cruz through the glass empire she once built, and will one day reclaim. 3 months earlier, the Hudson wore a color that had no name, somewhere between slate and sorrow, while the city arranged itself outside Elena's window like a grid of promises no one intended to keep. She had worked late enough that the world felt underwater. Drafts rustled. A thin wind moved along the glass. The lamps on her desk drew circles of amber around stacks of calculations, each line as exact as a vow. The courier was a quiet intrusion, a leather-gloved hand, a clipped apology for the hour, a black envelope with no return address, its weight out of proportion to its size, as if it had swallowed a future whole. Elena signed without looking up, set the envelope beside her T-squares, and finished annotating a load diagram. Precision was how she emptied herself of feeling. You cannot despair while calibrating a cantilever to within a tolerance of breath. Later, with the apartment hushed and the river muttering its endless arithmetic, she slid a blade under the seal. A flash drive, obsidian and small, fell into her palm. No note, no sender, only an engraved initial on the metal, a single serifed A that could have belonged to anyone, and therefore belonged to someone she already feared. She stood very still, as if motion would invite the world to tilt. Then she crossed to the console, inserted the drive, and the first file bloomed across the screen. A restaurant, white linen, the sort of candlelight that flatters deceit. Nate leaned toward a woman Elena did not know, listening in the way he had once listened to her, head dipped, smile unconcealed, attention like a caress. The woman's face was luminous with certainty. She touched his wrist, the gesture so practiced it felt remembered rather than invented. Elena paused the video. The room was quiet enough to hear the slow tick of her grandmother's travel clock on the shelf. Antique brass, face slightly foxed, the only inheritance she had kept at arm's length because it kept time too honestly. She pressed play again. Another scene, the same pair at a boardroom table, the city punitive behind them. Winter light, blue and pitiless. Nate laughed at something off camera. The woman's hair was loosened now, an intimacy disguised as fatigue. They left together, a hand at her back, the elevator mirrors doubling their departure into infinity. A third file, then a fourth. Hotel corridors, black cars, a hand on a doorknob, a mouth finding a mouth in the hush before the world remembers to be loud. Elena moved through each video without flinching. Shock had geography. She recognized its borders. It began at the collarbone, spread to the tongue, and finally stilled the hands. She noticed that her pen, abandoned, left a precise ink moon on the blueprint beneath it. When the final file ended, the drive presented a folder of scanned receipts and calendar entries. Business dinners for two coded as client meetings. A site visit in Miami the same weekend she had defended a tender alone. Jewelry labeled as branding gifts. Her name appeared only as an absence where it should have been, like a beam omitted from a structure and expected, nonetheless, to bear the weight. There is a noise a heart makes when it chooses silence over breaking. Elena heard it, and architect that she was, measured the span of that silence, the deflection it could bear before failure. She reopened the first video and watched more closely, the way she examined seams in glass when the eye wanted only the view. She learned the woman's profile by increments, A curve of cheek, a half laugh, the polish of someone who had paid attention to rooms all her life. Later, much later, the name would reach Elena like a rumor that confirmed itself. Ava LaRue. At this hour, she was only a fact in motion. Elena shut the screen. The city returned, full of windows that pretended to be stars. She walked to the kitchen and poured water with ceremonial care. Her hands were steady. This frightened her most. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a miniature spanner, a photograph, two silhouettes on a rooftop, hair blown toward the same point on the compass. The caption Nate had scrawled once, "We built the horizon." She slid the photograph into a drawer and closed it, as if lowering a body. It would have been easy to call him. Demand, accuse, beg. She did none of those things. Instead, she returned to her desk and spread a new sheet of vellum. She wrote the date in the corner, then a list. Accounts, trace anomalies, last 12 months. Board, contingency language in partnership agreements. Counsel, quietly. Proof of authorship, of origin, of every line that was ever hers. The list looked like the beginning of a building. She found comfort in that. Foundations laid in ink. At 3 in the morning, the apartment shifted. Heat moved in the walls. The river exhaled. She remembered the first time Nate had touched her wrist in a meeting, years ago, when she was the only woman at a table full of men explaining why her numbers were too elegant to be true. Afterward, in the elevator, he had said, "You made them believe in the math like it was music." He had watched her as if calculation were a kind of light. Some men love the sun, she thought, until they learn it does not revolve around them. She slept for an hour on the sofa, dreamless. Dawn arrived as an argument between violet and gold. She woke with a shiver that belonged more to decision than to cold. The drive still waited like a verdict on the console. She unplugged it, slipped it into the pocket of her robe, and dialed an internal extension no one outside the firm knew. The one that led to a server room whose hum had always sounded to her like patience. Julian answered, voice roughed by sleep and loyalty. She asked him to meet her early. "Bring the logs," she said. "I need to see what remains after deletion." While the kettle muttered, she gathered the stray proofs of a life. Calculators, model fragments, a stray cufflink she didn't recognize. She straightened the living room as if tidiness could contain calamity. Her grandmother's clock chimed the half hour, a plangent metallic reassurance that time, indifferent, had no quarrel with her. Near the door she hesitated and opened a narrow closet where a dress hung under muslin, the one she had planned to wear the night the Crystal Tower won its final permit. Black, unornamented, precise. She had never worn it. For a long moment she looked at the dress, as one might study a bridge before crossing. Calculating span, stress, consequence. Then she shut the door and felt the small give of fabric swaying in the dark. A pendulum that counted what could not be regained. By the time she left, the city's first taxis were drawing punctuation marks along the curb. She carried the flash drive like a relic and walked into the frost-smelling morning. On the sidewalk, a newspaper lay open to a photograph of Nate smiling in a doorway, the caption predicting a boom year for Hale and Cruz. Elena glanced once, then continued past, choosing not to correct the tense the world had chosen for her. In the elevator at the office, her reflection hovered in the mirrored walls, sleepless, composed, already elsewhere. She touched the pocket where the drive lay and felt its small, tyrannical geometry. Evidence had weight. She could design the load paths of this too. When the doors opened, Julian was waiting with a laptop and a paper cup that steamed like forgiveness. He looked at her face and did not ask the wrong question. She nodded toward the server room. They walked together into the hum. Behind them, the city brightened by degrees, the way truth does when it no longer asks permission. Evening fell like velvet, the color of secrets. It had snowed just enough to soften the city's edges, to hush the avenues so that tires sighed and footsteps sounded ceremonial. In the penthouse, lamplight skimmed the steel ribs of the bookshelf and laid a patient glow across Elena's desk. She had aligned the evidence the way a conservator arranges artifacts before a curator arrives. The flash drive, a printed ledger with modest numbers that, placed end to end, drew the outline of a theft, and a photograph of the Crystal Tower in scaffolding. Her pencil corrections like faint veins of mercury. Keys turned in the lock. Nate entered with winter on his coat, the quick heat of the lobby still on his cheeks, the old habit of a smile already reaching for its place. He carried coffee, two, one in each hand, the way a man carries peace offerings to a minor god. "I thought you'd still be at the site," he said, shrugging off his wool. "They asked me to stop by Carraro's, picked up that blend you like." He held out the cup. He did not yet see the careful geometry on the table. Elena regarded the coffee as if it had spoken. "Set it down," she said quietly. Her voice was threaded silk, soft, tensile, impossible to tear. He set both cups on the console, the paper lids whispering as they kissed the wood. "Lena," he began. She turned the laptop toward him. The screen bloomed with a pause frame, his hand at the small of a woman's back. Candlelight, linen, the tilt of intimacy. "Watch," Elena said. For a moment he did not move. Then his body, trained to perform in boardrooms and breakfasts and interviews that bled charm, remembered itself. He stepped to the desk, pressed play, and stood in the light of his other life. In the video he leaned, laughing. In the room he did not. When the scene ended, she opened the next, and then the next, the smooth chronicle of an absence given shape. He did not deny it. Denial would have been a shared language, and they had exhausted those. When the final file darkened, he exhaled a breath that was almost relief. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said, and she watched the sentence erect its scaffolding of gentleness around a structure built to collapse. "How did you want me to find out?" Elena asked. "At a gala? In a headline? On a day the tower was finished so I wouldn't ruin the photographs?" He closed his eyes as if light had turned cruel. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" The words were not a question. She turned another page, not a video now, but numbers, restaurant codes, hotel codes, a gift labeled branding. "You itemized affection as marketing. You charged silk to public relations. You called a bet a site visit." His jaw tightened. "It's more complicated than that." "Complicated is a bridge with 6 load paths and 1 hidden fault," she said. "This is arithmetic." He lifted a hand, let it fall. "I wasn't planning to hurt you." A small, lost boy spoke through a man accustomed to being forgiven. "I was planning to leave. Carefully, with respect." "With half," she said. The ledger lay between them the way a river lies between two countries. "Half the firm. Half of what I built when you were busy naming rooms after donors. Half of drawings you never held in your hands." "I held you," he said softly, "when you were too tired to care if the beam would carry or the board would balk." "Did you?" It came out without heat. "And then you learned how to hold applause instead." She rested her fingertips on the desk, calming a tremor that belonged less to anger than to accuracy. "When were you going to tell me?" Nate looked toward the windows where the city pressed its luminous cheek to the glass. "Soon." After the opening, he swallowed. After the settlement terms were gentle. Elena let the quiet lengthen until it shaped the room. "Gentle," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were a foreign fruit. "You've always had a genius for surfaces, Nate, for how things look when seen from a favorable angle." He flinched at genius, as if the syllables burned. "I was never your enemy," he said, "but I couldn't stay. Do you know what it's like to sit beside brilliance and feel yourself evaporate? You don't hear what people say when you leave a room." "I hear what the buildings say," she answered. "It's louder." He took a step closer. She felt the old magnet of him tug at the air, the one that had drawn her once, when he was new and praise tasted like rain. "Elena, I don't want a war. We can divide the work. We can keep the teams intact. I'm entitled to my share of what we created." She lifted her gaze to his, steady as a plumb line. "You are entitled to what you created." A flutter, the smallest bird, crossed her voice and was gone. "Tell me, Nate, what would you like to keep? The equations? The sleeplessness? The way a roof sits on your chest when a wind model fails? Choose, take them. Take all the parts that are me." He looked away first. In the glass he was 2 men, one facing her, one already turned. "Don't do this," he said. Don't make me the villain because you prefer calculations to company. I tried, Lena. For years I tried to be enough for a woman who married a skyline. And you married applause. She did not raise her voice, she lowered it, and that was worse. The difference is that applause stops when the music ends. The skyline remains. Silence unspooled. The radiator clicked as if counting. Snow ticked at the windows like a gentle insistence. At last he said, "I'm moving out." The words were almost tender. "I'll have my lawyer propose a framework. We'll be fair." "Fairness," she said, and smiled without humor. "Tell Ava that word. See how it looks on her mouth." The name landed like a glass dropped on thick carpet. No shatter, just the heavy knowledge of what should have broken. Nate's eyes flickered. "You know her name?" "I know her history." She slid a thin dossier across the table. He didn't touch it. "But I don't need to. You were enough." A sound rose in his throat, anger or appeal, she could not tell. He caught it before it reached the air. "I loved you," he said, and there was truth in it, complicated as a cathedral. "I love you. I can't live as the man I am when I'm with you." "Then be the man you prefer," she replied. No engineer would argue with a material that declares its failure at a given stress. He put on his coat in movements too careful to be casual. At the door he paused, hand on the cool brass. "You don't have to fight me," he said without turning. "You could let go. You could let me go." She watched his back, broad and familiar as an old horizon. "I already did," she said. The latch gave a small, astonished sigh as the door closed. The apartment reassembled itself around the vacancy he left. Elena stood for a long while, listening to the quiet as if it were a new instrument. Then she crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the city glittered with its indifferent stars. And somewhere, far below, the river moved unoffended toward the ocean, carrying what it must, relinquishing what it could. On the desk, the photo of the tower under scaffolding lay half in shadow. She turned it face down and smoothed the corner with her thumb. When she finally sat, the chair accepted her weight with the mercy of an old friend. She opened a clean folder and wrote 3 words on the tab in small, immaculate print. "Load paths, human." Then she began to draw, not lines but boundaries, not arches but terms, the shapes by which a life might stand when weather changed. The door had closed with the soft incredulity of brass, surprised by its own obedience. Afterward, the apartment gathered itself around silence the way snow gathers around a footprint, filling, smoothing, keeping the shape while pretending at purity. Elena stood where Nate had left her, palms flat on the desk, as if feeling for tremors the instruments had missed. Winter leaned its forehead against the glass. The river below moved with the slow purpose of something that had already decided. In the kitchen, the coffee he brought had cooled into a small, dark refusal. She poured both cups into the sink and watched the spiral go, twin storms that resolved into nothing. Phones discover when you are breakable. The first call was from a number that used to be a dinner table, old friends with new caution in their voices, the syllables padded with sympathy, as if grief were a fragile heirloom. She let it ring. The second was her mother, whose love arrived as directives disguised as comfort. The third was the board chair, whose message contained concern like a needle threaded through silk. "Call when you can. Optics matter." Elena turned the phones face down until they were simply black squares reflecting her, a woman held together by a geometry of will. The email came at 11:03, terse as a diagnosis. Subject: accounts from, unlisted at Proton. Message: check the corporate cards from March. Look for retainer fees. He isn't just leaving, he's taking. No sign-off, no name, only the chill of someone who knew the map of her life well enough to mark its hidden roads. She sat. The act of folding into the chair felt like entering herself again. Fingers on keys, she accessed the firm's portal. Numbers assembling obediently at her call. Columns and categories standing to attention like soldiers awaiting inspection. There is a kindness to data. It does not pretend a feeling. Line by line, she followed money to the rooms where it had changed clothes. A retainer labeled consultation. Corporate restructuring led to a boutique law firm, whose press photographs specialized in the angle of victory. A sequence of modest transfers, each too small to provoke alarms, altogether enough to pay for a future, flowed toward an accounting consultancy known for asset valuations during separations. Dinners that weren't dinners, flights that weren't flights. The exquisite housekeeping of betrayal. Elena printed nothing. She took screenshots, encrypted them, sent a copy to a cloud that refused to live anywhere in the world a court could easily summon. She felt strangely calm, the way clarity sometimes feels like anesthesia. Numbers accrued like snowfall on a ledge, silent and certain, until weight made itself known. Her grandmother's little brass clock ticked on the shelf, too honest to conspire with any narrative but time. When it chimed midnight, the sound entered her ribs and measured the distance between before and after. She closed her eyes and allowed the pain to speak in its native language. It arrived as memory, an elevator years ago, Nate's hand hovering near her shoulder, their reflection in the mirrored panel making them two and then four and then many, endless versions of a future certain and golden. She saw, too, a conference hall fresh with fluorescent certainty, men explaining to her what her own calculations meant, and the way Nate's gaze had settled on her then. Not worship, not even awe, but something like belief. She opened her eyes. Belief, she thought, is only noble until it asks to be paid in ownership. She rose and moved through the rooms as if they were pages she had written, but not yet edited. On the credenza, a model of the tower under glass, a lattice of steel and acrylic assembled in long, exacting nights, cast clean little shadows on the wood. She lifted the bell jar and touched a spire with the tip of a fingernail. The model gave the faintest ring, a sound like thought becoming consequence. In the study, she opened the flat files where her drawings slept. Graphite and vellum, signatures where law prefers to find truth. She selected what mattered most. First sketches, low diagrams, the ugly, birth drafts that artists do not show anyone because they make later beauty credible. Into a portfolio they went, then into a fire safe, locked with a code the body remembers better than the mind. Back at the desk, she wrote another list, this one without numbers. Notify counsel at dawn. Secure author proofs off-site. Rotate passwords. Freeze discretionary spend. Protect staff. Julian first. Do not bleed publicly. Do not beg privately. Do not let rage choose the architecture. The last line steadied her. Anger has a talent for building on sand and naming it bedrock. She would remain an engineer even in this. Design a structure that held when feeling tried to unhouse her. The window drew her, the city glittering with a patience that knew nothing of her drama. On the glass, her reflection floated over the skyline, like a ghost who hadn't yet chosen whether to haunt. Somewhere in the grid below, Ava probably slept easily, the kind of ease that comes from moving into a house someone else mortgaged. Elena refused the easy contempt that wanted to name her. Contempt was a blunt instrument. She needed a scalpel. She thought of the word aftershock. Engineers account for it. Those tremors that arrive once the damage is done. The elegant cruelty of stress redistributing itself. Walls cracked, not at impact, but in the quiet hours, when relief made people careless. That was when structures told the truth about their weakness. She would listen for the small noises now. A team member's sudden absence, a client's evasive email, a supplier's newly careful tone. At 2, the snow began again. It came as a hush through light, a suggestion rather than a storm. The city below accepted it without comment, as if being covered was another version of being seen. Elena made tea that tasted like clean decisions. She carried the cup to the living room and sat on the floor, back against the sofa, as if proximity to the ground could convince the heart that falling was no longer available. Her phone vibrated on the table. A text from Julian, timestamp late. I'm in early. Logs look odd. Call me when you wake. Beneath it, another message from a number she didn't recognize. I'm sorry. I thought you knew. A. She stared at the single letter until it stopped meaning anything at all. Then she deleted the message, not because she forgave it, but because she would not let it be archived in a place that also stored birthdays and receipts for books she loved. Toward 4, fatigue found her. It did not demand, it invited. She curled on the sofa and slept the neat, shallow sleep of someone resting under glass, visible to the stars, safe from nothing. She dreamed of bridges, one she'd designed in school, a sky bridge that joined two buildings brave enough to lean. In the dream, people crossed and never looked down. When she woke, a pale ribbon of mourning had already fastened itself to the windows. She showered in water that felt like a confession and dressed in the armor of her trade, black, precise, without decoration. Before she left, she opened the narrow closet and let her knuckles brush the muslin garment bag. The dress inside answered with a tiny breath of static, as if remembering her. "Not yet," she told it, and turned away. Outside, the city had reassembled into its accustomed grammar. Taxis wrote their yellow clauses. Pedestrians contributed commas. Steam rose from a manhole like an opinion. Elena walked through it with the serene posture of someone balancing a vessel on her head, knowing spills would be read as character. At the curb, a slush-gray sparrow hopped along the frozen seam and shook itself into courage. At the office, the guard's good morning arrived in the voice of a man who had learned not to read headlines into faces. In the elevator, Elena watched the numbers climb and felt a stubborn gratitude for machinery that simply does what it promises. When the doors slid open, Julian was there with 2 coffees and the map of a long night under his eyes. "I've pulled the backups," he said, foregoing greeting and pity both. "There are calendar ghosts, deleted entries that still hum in the server, purchases coded to a card I didn't know we had, and a retainer, corporate dissolution." He handed her a printout. His fingers trembled, but the paper did not. Elena took the pages. The aftershock, punctual as a metronome, moved through her, not collapse, but confirmation. She felt the building of her life tilt by a degree and then right itself on new footings. She looked up, let the breath leave her, and allowed a new thought to take the shape of resolve. "Archive everything," she said, quietly. "And Julian, today you are not my assistant. You are my witness." It began with a headline that looked harmless, as all erosion does. "A single drop learning the habit of stone." The Wall Street Chronicle ran it above the fold in a font that pretended to be dispassionate. Power couple parts. Hail on, surviving a workaholic marriage. Beneath it, a photograph. Nate at a cafe terrace. Early sun striking the bone of his cheek. Opposite him, a woman turned 3/4 from the lens. Ava, unnamed, composed in that fashionable candor, which suggests there is nothing to hide. The caption did not lie. It merely did not tell the truth. Elena found the paper waiting on the conference table when she stepped into the small room Julian had begun calling the War Office. 2 highlighters, a legal pad with neat black tabs. On the wall, a corkboard with strings that had not yet admitted they were strings. He lowered his eyes when he saw the photo, not out of shame, but as one lowers eyes in a church. The article accomplished its task with surgical grace. Nate opened with rueful admiration. "Elena is brilliant. I wouldn't be who I am without her." Yes, he conceded, success had required sacrifice. "We forgot to build a life," he murmured to the reporter's recorder, making his grief sound like a man remembering rain. There were lines about balance, about the human cost of building cities, about love starved by the feast of achievement. Nothing outrageous, nothing prosecutable, just enough to tilt the floor. Her phone bloomed with messages. The communal, "Are you okay?" that meant, "We've chosen a side. We hope you'll forgive us for." Invitations were rephrased as considerations. Dinners became coffees. Coffees became, "Let's circle back after the quarter." A gala chair wrote to, "Check in," which translated into, "Your presence may unsettle donors." Clients messaged the way a bridge speaks in wind. Testing, testing. Seeking the privilege of postponement. Elena read the article twice, then again aloud, as if meaning might behave differently when it had a voice. Nate's quotes were careful as lace. The paragraphs about her were a mirror angled to catch the least forgiving light. Dazzling, exacting, consumed. She could hear the city deciding, the way weather decides a coastline. Not in storms, but in the small insistence of every day. A notification pulsed. A blog devoted to architectural gossip posted a blind item so thinly veiled it may as well have been a parade. When genius turns to granite, whose fault is the chill? The comments gathered like gulls. Someone remembered being ignored at a reception. Someone else repeated a story third hand about her correcting a junior in public. Tiny truths, made heavy by the gravity of narrative. Even the compliments shifted their weight, changing emphasis the way light changes at 4 o'clock. Julian placed a cup of tea near her hand. "Do you want me to draft a response?" "To what?" she asked. "To weather?" He hesitated. "We could place a profile. You know, your process, your teaching, something that warms." "Warming looks like pleading when the wind is wrong," she said, then gentler. "Not yet." By noon, a podcast had uploaded a special episode about partnerships at the top, complete with a panel whose experiences resembled hers, the way a birthday candle resembles a lighthouse. A magazine DM'd for comment, offering her the privilege of half a column to correct a page and a half of inference. A young associate she'd mentored sent a message that began, "I'm so grateful," and ended with a careful request to join Nate's new team. Her apology structured like a resignation from gravity. Elena answered what required an answer, and carved silence around the rest. There is a dignity to distance when the ground is liquefying. She walked the perimeter of the office, paused before the corkboard, and studied the lines that weren't yet lines. Press dates, donors with loyalties, clients with appetites, the faint pencil mark where a favor might be asked that would cost more than the favor granted. She remembered an estuary she and her father had visited when she was a girl, the way water traveled in two directions at once, salt arguing with fresh. Tidal river, he had called it, pride in his voice, as if he'd made the phrase. She felt that brackish tug now, the backward pull of the past, the forward drag of what would be said next, both true, both unclean. Her mother finally reached her on the third attempt. "I won't ask questions," she said in the way that asked them, "but you should respond. People will think." "People are a tide, Mama," Elena said. "They come, they go. The shore is not responsible for what the moon decides. I never know if you're being wise or stubborn. They are the same in some climates." A longer pause. "Do you want me there? I want you to bake the almond cookies and eat them. I want you to water the basil. I want nothing in you to tilt toward this." She softened. "I'll call tonight." In the afternoon, a board member requested a quick alignment. The video meeting opened with compliments that wore helmets. He spoke of brand fragility and market confidence, phrases that she translated as, "We don't like to be near anything that bleeds." He wondered, as if genuinely curious, whether she might consider stepping back from the upcoming lecture series. "Until things settle." He used settle as if gravity were a moral lesson the universe could be taught. Elena listened. When he finished, she said, "I'll give the lectures from the drawings. They have always settled more than any rumor." He smiled because that was what the face does when it loses an argument it did not understand was happening. By evening, the city had adopted the narrative with the efficiency of a school learning a new anthem. Profile pieces bloomed like algae, the price of precision, when brilliance burns the house it built. They quoted men she had corrected once, women she had disappointed by being unavailable to lunch, interns who had adored her rigor until it stood in the way of their ease. No one lied. That was the elegance of it. The firm's PR consultant called, voice-trained to pitch reassurance as an outcome. "We can do a human interest feature," she suggested. "Photos in your studio, maybe your childhood. People love origin stories. If you cry, cry once." "I won't cry for economy," Elena said, "and I cannot take pictures in the studio. The light has no patience for pretending." After she hung up, she opened the thin dossier she had placed beneath heavier folders. On its cover, authorship, primary proof. Inside, the ink ghosts of her first thoughts. A throat-clearing curve becoming a span. A trapezoid corrected into grace. Sums done without ruler because the mind had memorized distance. She laid them across the table like relics that had the decency to contain their own miracles. Twilight arrived early, a violet forgiveness the city did not deserve. Elena stood at the window and watched the glass empire she had helped to raise invent a new dusk for itself. On the street below, pedestrians hurried with the forward lean of those pursued by schedules and weather. In an opposite window, a woman placed a lamp on a table and transformed a square of darkness into a room. The article's last line returned to her, as good journalism is designed to do. He hopes they both find a way to live again, separately, with grace. It was the word grace that caught. A soft knife, a silk cord. How polite of him to wish her grace while he borrowed her story and improved its lighting. Julian came back at 6 with the look of a boy who had learned a new gravity. 2 clients pushed. One wants to reevaluate leadership structure. The interns, some of them are asking for letters. He swallowed. I'll stay. You'll go home, she said, and you'll sleep. I can't. You can, she said, because I can't, and one of us should. He managed a brief smile and gathered his bag. At the door, he turned. It isn't true, he said, and she understood that he meant none of it, and all of it, the headlines and the undertow. It's just loud. Loud is a form, Elena said. It passes. When he left, the office returned to its native hum. She sat and wrote a single sentence on a blank page. The building doesn't care about your marriage. It cares whether the mathematics holds. Then she crossed it out. Not because it wasn't true, but because truth required a tenderness she had not yet earned today. Outside, a wind rose, making the facades sing. You could hear it if you knew how to listen. A low, precise music produced when air finds the smallest seams and writes its name there. She stood in that sound until it braided itself into steadiness, until she could imagine a day on which she might, in fact, answer, not with tears, nor with PR, but with the only language the city could not refute. Ink, line, proof. The first meeting took place in a room without warmth, an upper floor in a midtown tower where the windows were sealed and the view, though expensive, offered no comfort. Winter sunlight leaked through smoked glass, flat and colorless. A car horn sounded somewhere far below, the city's pulse reduced to an echo. Elena sat at the end of the conference table, her hands resting lightly on a folder of documents that looked as though they might catch fire if touched too harshly. Across from her, Nate arrived with the punctuality of a man who understood the optics of delay. He had changed since she last saw him, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the fine-tuned confidence of someone who believed the story he had rehearsed in private. Between them, the table stretched like a courtroom built without benches. Lawyers filled the spaces where affection had once lived. Mara Lindholm, Elena's new counsel, was composed in gray silk, her tone quiet, deliberate, impossible to interrupt. She spread the firm's contract papers in front of her like the pages of an old prayer book. Nate's team was led by a woman named Claudine Mercer, famous for her skill in turning sentiment into settlement. Her smile was as sharp as the reflection of a knife in water. Let's begin, Claudine said, clasping her manicured hands together. Our position remains the same. Mr. Hale is entitled to 50% of the firm's assets, intellectual property, and any royalties from past or ongoing projects initiated during the partnership. Her words were precise. Each syllable was another nail in a scaffold she intended to dismantle. Mara's reply came soft and unhurried. The firm's designs, the blueprints, patents, and intellectual work exist under the authorship of Ms. Cruz. Mr. Hale's name appears on business contracts only. There is a distinction between representation and creation. Claudine smiled. Representation, Ms. Lindholm, is often what makes creation possible. Without Mr. Hale's network and development strategies, none of those designs would have left the paper they were drawn on. We intend to show that his contribution was not incidental. It was equal. Equal, Elena said for the first time. Her voice was calm, low, a tremor contained within control. Equal implies parity of labor. If Nate spent nights solving thermal load equations or calculating beam deflection at sunrise, then yes, equal. Elena, Nate began, but she lifted a hand. I'm not finished. The room tilted toward her quietness. If he wrote the technical manuscripts, reviewed regulatory models, or designed the cantilever structure the city said was impossible, then he can have his half. But charm doesn't produce tensile strength, and smiles don't win safety permits. Nate inhaled sharply. You make it sound as if I did nothing but shake hands. You shook the right ones, she said. I'll give you that. The silence afterward was not empty. It was layered, filled with the weight of unsaid years. Claudine resumed, her tone silk again, as though civility were a crown she wore by force of habit. We understand this is emotional. However, The record will show that the firm's reputation benefited equally from both founders. Mr. Hale's leadership was public-facing, which carries measurable value. Mara's pen paused above the contract. Value is not the same as authorship, she said. And reputation, Ms. Mercer, isn't property that can be divided. The negotiation unfolded in increments of ice. Claudine recited itemized claims, corporate accounts, brand equity, client goodwill. Mara countered with clauses, precedents, architectural authorship rights. Each word was a careful instrument, each pause a detonation disguised as etiquette. But the emotional siege was already underway. Claudine reached into a folder and drew out a new document. "We'll also be filing for compensatory damages for emotional distress," she said lightly. "Given the climate Ms. Cruz created during the latter years of the marriage, the imbalance of power, the emotional neglect, it constitutes professional cruelty, if not domestic." Mara's eyes lifted, unblinking. "You're suggesting an engineer caused emotional distress by exceeding her husband's ambition?" "I'm suggesting," Claudine replied, "that my client was subjected to an environment in which his contributions were consistently minimized. That sort of treatment leaves a mark, Miss Lindholm. We believe the court will sympathize." Elena stared at the polished table until the reflection of her hands blurred. "He was having an affair," she said. "An affair that resulted from years of emotional starvation," Claudine countered, as if reciting a diagnosis. "Our position is that Mr. Hale attempted to address the imbalance several times. Ms. Cruz, you were otherwise occupied." The words pierced with clinical precision. A blush rose beneath Elena's skin, not of shame, but of fury restrained. Mara placed a quiet hand near hers, not touching, simply reminding her that control was its own weapon. "If this is the argument you wish to bring to court," Mara said evenly, "you'll need to establish measurable harm. I advise you to reconsider before introducing such fiction to the record." Claudine smiled again, that smile made of polish and threat. "We don't believe it's fiction. We have testimonials from clients who'll testify that Mr. Hale was integral to the success of multiple projects. His vision, his diplomacy, his guidance. Many describe the firm as a collaborative effort." Elena felt the room's temperature drop another degree. She recognized the names on the page. Claudine slid forward. Clients she had dined with, negotiated with, built for. The signatures were genuine, the betrayal systematic. "He's been collecting these for months," she murmured. "Protecting himself," Claudine corrected. Mara gathered the papers, scanning them with the precision of someone assembling a battlefield map. "Your client," she said, "appears to have prepared this narrative long before the separation. Perhaps while using company funds for private travel." Claudine's eyelid flickered. Too brief for denial, too practiced for guilt. "We'll deny any such misuse," she said. "There's no proof those expenses were personal." Elena's laugh, soft, sudden, brief, broke through like a crack in porcelain. "There's proof enough," she said, "but it doesn't matter. You can keep your spreadsheets and your statements. You've already decided which of us should apologize for working too hard." Nate leaned forward. "Elena, please. This isn't—" "Don't," she said, cutting him off, her voice lower now, intimate enough to remind him of every moment when that tone had been reserved for affection. "Don't ask for mercy and call it fairness." The meeting adjourned on a technicality. Clauses to review, valuations to finalize. But no one in that room mistook it for pause. It was a ceasefire, temporary and treacherous. Outside, the city glared white with late light, glass and snow conspiring to blind. Elena stepped onto the sidewalk and breathed air that felt borrowed. Mara joined her, lighting a cigarette despite the wind. "That went as badly as possible," she said. "I lost control," Elena replied. "Yes," Mara said, exhaling smoke that curled like thought. "And they recorded every word. Expect the parasite line to appear in the filings." Elena closed her eyes. "I gave him everything." "No," Mara said gently. "You gave him access to everything. There's a difference." They walked a block without speaking, their reflections sliding along the mirrored facades like travelers searching for exits. At the corner, Mara stopped. "You have a choice now," she said. We can keep it legal, slow, procedural, ruinous, or we can make it painful. Painful means reputation. It means strategy. It means no one will want to stand next to him when this is over. Elena turned her gaze toward the skyline, the one she had helped build, and that now seemed to rise in quiet judgment. Who would handle that? Mara's smile was small, approving. I know someone, a strategist, a surgeon with stories. Her name's Zafira Lauron. She doesn't fix reputations, she rewrites them. Elena looked back at her reflection in the glass doors of the tower, a woman stripped of certainty, framed by the empire she had designed, yet still upright. Set up the meeting, she said, and the city, as if it understood the declaration, carried her voice into its corridors of steel and echo. Night gathered without argument. It came down the avenues like velvet drawn by an unseen hand, muffling horns, softening glass, laying a hush even over the obstinate river. Elena let herself into the apartment and did not turn on the lights. She wanted the city's dimness, the honest outlines of familiar things at their truest scale. In the half-dark, the furniture remembered where it belonged. Only she did not. She set her bag on the console and stood there, palms resting on the wood, as if she could feel the grain decide what the evening would allow. The day still clung to her, the stale courthouse air, the polished sentences designed to wound without leaving fingerprints, the way Nate had said fairness as though it were a synonym for forget. A clock somewhere marked the hour with a sound like a silver coin dropped on marble. Time, precise. Heart, not. She went to the kitchen and found the bottle she had kept for a victory that never materialized. The court gave up its post with a soft sigh. She poured a single glass and carried it to the living room, where the model of the tower slept beneath its bell jar. For a long moment, she only looked. It remained, as ever, immaculate. A small cathedral of intention, each joint a promise she had once been strong enough to keep. Elena lifted the dome and reached in. Her fingertip rested against one of the slender braces. The model sang, a brief, almost imperceptible note, like breath touching crystal. She pressed harder. The brace bowed, then snapped with a sound that was both nothing and everything. Another and another. Clean fractures, the kind that, in real scale, could be repaired if addressed with honesty and time. When she was finished, the model lay changed but not ruined, its symmetry shaken, its arrogance corrected. She set the bell jar back over it as if closing a wound in air, then sat on the floor with her back against the sofa and did what she had refused to do in all the crowded rooms of the day. She cried, not the controlled tears of a woman preserving a legend, but the unschooled weeping of a body that had finally decided it would not be conscripted by dignity tonight. It came in waves, then smaller waves, then the delicate afterlap that cleans a shore of salt. She pressed her palms to her eyes and felt the hot architecture of her own face, the angles inhabited and taken for granted. When it passed, the room returned, patient as a dog that had waited on the far side of grief. She rose and washed her face. In the mirror, a stranger with Elena's mouth regarded her without verdict. All right, she thought. Now we build. She moved through the apartment, turning on lamps, forgiving the corners their shadows. The desk welcomed her with its old obedience, the way paper agrees to be marked, the way a pencil's weight in the hand can restore a person to the scale of choice. On a fresh sheet, she wrote a single word at the top, plan, but not the brittle kind, not a staircase hammered together from anger. This had to be a drawing with load paths, redundancies, clear points of failure acknowledged and accounted for. She drew a rectangle and divided it into rooms the way a life divides itself once it has learned the geography of harm. Room 1, evidence. Dates, signatures, proofs, the low, irrefutable music of what happened. She listed servers, backups, off-site copies. Julian would shepherd them, unobtrusive and exact. She added a small star beside his name and wrote the word protect. Room 2, voice. Not PR, not interview as alibi. A sequence of appearances where the work could stand without needing to be narrated by grief. Lectures already scheduled. Acceptances she had ignored. A paper she owed to a journal that did not recognize gossip as currency. She would say nothing of the marriage. She would talk about cantilevers, about fatigue, about beauty that refuses collapse. She would let the audience come to its own arithmetic. Room 3. Allies. Mara, precise as winter light. Perhaps this Zafira Loron, if the woman existed in the city at the level rumors suggested. A small list of colleagues who believed in mathematics more than in myth. Her mother, yes, but only for pastries and scolding and the memory of aprons. Friends who would not offer pity as a mirror. Room 4. Mercy. Not for Nate, for herself. To allow a morning without reading the chorus. To plant basil. To sleep without earning it. She set down the pencil and sat back. The plan looked less like war and more like a blueprint rescued from a flood. Still legible, edges softened where water had tried and failed to erase them. She felt, for the first time in days, the faint lift at the breastbone that engineers recognize when calculations reconcile after hours of refusing to agree. In the bedroom, she opened the narrow closet and slid the muslin garment bag forward until it whispered on its hanger. She loosened the ribbon at the top and parted the cloth. The dress within stared back with the serenity of black satin. She pressed her palm to it. Not for him, she said to the quiet. For the room. She imagined the night, faces upturned, the dome above, her name a rumor on the air like rain about to begin. The thought did not thrill her. It steadied her. Back in the living room, she gathered the broken braces of the model into a small porcelain dish, the one her grandmother had used for lemon seeds. The fragments looked absurdly delicate, like things a sparrow might carry to line a nest. She let her fingers rest in them until cool touched skin, and skin learned coolness back. The phone on the table emitted a discreet chime. A message from Mara. Zafira can see you tomorrow, 10 o'clock. She asked for nothing but the truth. Another from Julian, sent late and clearly against his own instincts. Saw the piece in the Chronicle. For what it's worth, the interns think you're terrifying and holy. We're in early, logs humming. Elena smiled at that, an expression not of happiness but of recognition. Terrifying and holy. As if integrity, in a certain light, must always look like both. She turned off notifications, not as retreat, but as preparation. The room exhaled. Outside, the city redistributed its light among the hour's survivors. Nurses changing shifts. A baker hauling sacks of flour like contraband hope. Two girls in jeweled beanies conducting their midnight parliament on a stoop. The world, indifferent and kind, continued. On the desk, under the page titled Plan, she placed another sheet and wrote a sentence across its width. A beam meant to carry the day to come. Build what cannot be taken. She underlined it once, then twice, not with anger, but with gratitude for the clarity that sometimes only arrives in the wake of ruin. Near dawn, she made tea. Steam pirouetted from the cup in elaborate silence. She wrapped her hands around the heat and stood by the window, letting the city emerge from its grayscale like a photograph learning color in a bath. The river announced itself in silver. The roofs brightened. Across the street, a woman opened her window and shook a cloth as if she were wringing night from it, letting darkness drip onto the morning below. When Elena dressed, she chose a black suit with a narrow collar and a white shirt as crisp as a new truth. She pinned her hair back in a style that had intimidated boards and comforted students. At the door, she paused, habit, superstition, and looked once at the bell jar, at the reconfigured model glinting with honest wounds. It was not ruined. It was merely accurate. Good, she said to the room, to the city, to the self that had wept and the self that would not. Let's proceed. She took the portfolio, slid the plan inside, and stepped into the hall where the day waited. Unsentimental, exact, already humming with the low voltage of what could be made from what had been lost. Zafira Loren kept her office inside a narrow townhouse that looked as if it had practiced the art of discretion for a century. The street was quiet, a short block where the trees seemed to whisper in a language reserved for people who knew when to lower their voices. Inside, the air carried faint notes of bergamot and old paper. Light fell through high windows in measured bands, like a metronome laid across the room. A receptionist with a scholar's calm led Elena down a corridor where every frame on the wall contained a black square of silk. Clients' names, she said, catching the question in Elena's glance. Unwritten, but present. She opened a tall door without knocking. Miss Loron. Zafira rose from behind a desk that was bare except for a legal pad and a fountain pen the color of midnight. She was older than Elena by a generous decade. Her silver-streaked hair gathered as if it had decided on dignity early and never needed to renegotiate. Her suit had the sort of fit that makes tailoring look like theology. "Miss Cruz," she said, in a voice that sounded like the answer to a question one hadn't yet learned how to ask. "Welcome. Sit wherever you won't feel seen." Elena chose a chair by the window, half in light, half in shade. Zafira sat opposite and studied her in the way doctors used to before machines took over. Alert to breath, to posture, to what a mouth does in the second before words become sentences. "I don't take many cases," Zafira began. "Not because I'm selective in some glamorous way, but because most people want revenge. I'm not a weapon, I'm a lens." A pause. "Do you want revenge?" Elena considered. The honest answer was a chord with more than one note. "I want accuracy," she said. "I want the map to match the terrain." Zafira's smile was almost private. "Good. Accuracy has a longer shelf life than rage." She uncapped the pen with a soft click. "Tell me what happened, not in the order it occurred, but in the order you felt it." Elena spoke. About the envelope, the videos, the ledger entries that had changed clothes to escape detection. About Nate's easy gentleness while planning a future banked in other accounts. About the headlines that sounded like apologies to the wrong person. As she talked, Zafira wrote nothing, only listened until listening became a kind of architecture, space made for truth to inhabit without flinching. When Elena finished, the room rested with her. Outside, a truck coughed down the block, a door latched somewhere with temperate politeness. Zafira replaced the pen's cap. "What do you want to protect most?" she asked. "The work," Elena said. The answer arrived before thought. "The authorship. And my staff. And what would you like to lose?" Zafira's eyes softened the way a blade softens when it realizes it will become a key. "What is heavy and unhelpful?" "The instinct to explain," Elena said, surprised by the speed of it. "The urge to be understood by people who enjoy not understanding." Zafira nodded. "Good. Then here is how we proceed. There are only 3 levers that move public belief: proof, pattern, and poise." She held up one finger. "Proof. We audit the story. I will need access to backups, to calendars that forgot how to lie, to expense trails where romance announced itself as research. You have someone you trust inside the firm? Julian. He knows where the ghosts hum. Have him collect quietly. We don't leak yet. We inventory. Evidence doesn't only convince others, it steadies the owner." A second finger. "Pattern. People forgive anomalies. They fear systems. If Mr. Hale's betrayal felt orchestrated, it likely was, and with practice. We examine timelines. We trace when his quotes about balance began to appear and who placed them. If Ms. LaRue has a curriculum vitae of conquest, we document it. Not to shame her, but to show architecture, how men and myths get built." Elena thought of Ava's text, the single initial apologizing for a theft conducted as ceremony. "And if there is no pattern, then we do nothing with it," Zafira said. "Truth is not obliged to be convenient." A third finger. "Poise. You will not speak about your marriage. You will speak about design. You will accept the invitations you once declined because work seemed more honest than its explanation. You will write the paper you owe. You will give 3 lectures, no more, no fewer, on failure, fatigue, and the aesthetics of load. When asked about the articles, you will smile as if the weather has been mentioned, and glance at the drawings as though they are the only citizens of your country." Elena let a breath leave her. "That sounds like restraint." "It is," Zafira said. "Restraint is charisma for adults." She leaned forward, elbows on the sleek dark of the desk. "One more thing. You must choose a moment, not a press ambush, a moment with ceremony, a room that understands the cost of standing. There you will appear, not to clang cymbals, but to borrow the room's spine. Does such a room exist?" Elena saw it at once, a geometry already loved. "The Sky Dome," she said. "London, the Glass and Light Gala." "Yes," Zafira said simply, as if the plan had been waiting in the air for a mouth to claim it. "They owe you more than an invitation. They owe you gravity. We will arrange remarks that do not require you to speak. Elena felt the smallest current of something like relief. What do you require of me today? Three things, Zafira said. First, permission to be impolite on your behalf. Second, the discipline to remain elegant when inelegance would feel medicinal. Third, a statement you will not publish. She slid a sheet of paper across the table. Write the ugliest, truest thing you would say to him if the world were only you and a doorframe. Then give it to me. Her gaze didn't waver. I'll keep it safe, and you will have said it somewhere. Elena looked at the blank page. Words arrived that she had refused to think in full sentences. She wrote, hand steady, then folded the paper once and handed it across. Zafira did not read it. She slipped it into a slim envelope and placed it inside a drawer that closed with a whisper. Good, she said. Now we begin with small kindnesses for yourself dressed up as tactics. You will sleep. You will eat food no magazine would photograph. You will call your mother and let her waste your time. You will not read comment sections, even in your own mind. Elena managed a smile that felt like a joint relearning its motion. And you? I will set the table, Zafira answered. A journalist with a spine will request a conversation about authorship. Two curators will remember your contributions to the dome they celebrate beneath. A donor will ask whether the right name is engraved on the right plaque. And the world, which had been so eager to believe a simpler story, will be softly embarrassed by its haste. She rose, signaling an end that was also a beginning. At the door, she paused. Last question. Do you still love him? Elena took time before admitting that the answer had corners. I love the version of him that listened to the math like it was music, she said. But I no longer love the man who prefers applause to proof. Zafira's expression accepted both realities. That will help, she said. When Elena stepped back into the winter noon, the street sounded newly tuned. Cabs spoke in their usual grammar, but softer. A bicycle's bell rang with the mercy of warning rather than alarm. She carried with her a list, a promise, and the quiet scandal of feeling heavier and lighter at once, weighted by plan, unburdened by bewilderment. At the corner, her phone vibrated. A message from Julian. Ghosts located, deletions that remember themselves. Lunch? Another from Mara. Board wants reassurance. I told them reassurance is not a legal instrument. We meet at 4. And from an unknown number, London code. Gala chair available this evening. Would Ms. Cruz accept a call? Elena looked toward the river that stitched the city to its own reflection. The water moved with the focused certainty of something that had never needed a headline to exist. She placed her hand over the inside pocket of her coat where the plan lay folded, warm from her body, and began to walk, with the tempered stride of someone who has learned how to proceed in a city that loves a story but respects a structure more. The server room spoke in its native hum, a soft, mechanical psalm that steadied the hands of people who believed in systems. Elena and Julian stood beneath the pale glow of recessed lights, while the racks exhaled their quiet heat. Here the city's gossip could not reach. Here truth wore the work clothes of voltage and checksum. Julian set the laptop on a rolling cart, cables coiling like patient serpents. Backups are intact, he said. Daily deltas for 18 months. Deletions that think themselves clever, but the ghosts still hum. Let them sing, Elena answered. He began the process with reverence, calling old calendars from their graves. The private one that synchronized badly on purpose. The public one minted for optics. A third registry no one was supposed to know existed, where appointments were written in nouns that meant something to only one person. The screen filled with entries reconstituting themselves. Meetings, flights, site visits, lunches that had always tasted faintly of performance. There, Julian said, tapping a cluster of dates like a constellation. 3 months before the first affair video. Board breakfast, harbor room. Cross-referenced against the building's access logs, he never entered the harbor room. Where was he? Hotel 2 blocks south. He tugged up a receipt, coded as Client Accommodation, International. Elena felt the particular stillness of a structure just before it reveals its fault. Pattern, she murmured, almost to the machines. Show me pattern. They mapped more than meetings. They mapped cadence. Quotes seeded along a timeline, like stepping stones across a river. Balance, partnership, the human cost of excellence. Interviews with friendly journalists. Panel discussions where Nate performed the trick of turning an anecdote into sympathy. The phrases began months before the ledger learned to disguise itself. Who placed these interviews? Elena asked. Julian traced email headers backwards until they arrived at a boutique PR address that did not belong to the firm. Ava introduced him, he said softly. She's copied on the early threads. He moved to expenses. The monitor began to populate with items that wanted to be believed. A bracelet disguised as donor engagement, a weekend flight hidden in a line item called site reconnaissance, an upgrade to a suite where, Elena checked, the city had no project within 100 miles. Each charge alone, a gentleman's error. Together, an ecosystem. Look at the timestamps, Julian said. See how he charges the dinners right after your late-night approvals go through? He knew when you'd be in the modeling software. He knew you wouldn't look up. Elena swallowed the salt of it. He learned my hours the way men learn tides. When they reached correspondence, they found a garden that had been weeded with care, but not with thoroughness. Traces remained in the soil. Email threads with subject lines rinsed of meaning. Follow-up, quick check, the thing we discussed. Attachments with sensible names whose metadata told a different story. Letters drafted to potential clients on firm letterhead that excluded her. Draft statements of joint authorship written in the soft focus of brand language. A PowerPoint titled Narrative Pillars that made her laugh, short and without joy. Narrative pillars, Julian repeated, and his hands became fists on the cart's handle. He's been erecting a little pantheon. Break no altar yet, she said. Name them first. He read, public empathy, burnout, vision, leading from the heart, equality, 2 founders, 1 legacy. The slides were all air and posture, but air can move oceans if given time and fetch. They took screenshots, preserved hashes, wrote down file paths as if they were coordinates to oil under ice. Zafira texted, a message delivered without fanfare. Inventory, not outrage. Pattern before proof. Then the pose. Elena replied with a single word. Understood. The second hard drive revealed the personal calendar imbricated with hers. Old anniversaries pinned by a man who saved dates out of habit. New dinners added like ivy. There were reminders to call her mother on holidays. There were also reminders with only 1 letter in them. A. It would have been easy to hate the economy of it. Instead, Elena hated the competence. Here, Julian said again, tracing a slender vein through the data. A list titled Succession, names of juniors, meeting times after hours. He's been building a Noah's Ark for the projects he thinks he can float. Which ones? The public pavilion, the library annex, anything with a confluence of flattering press and low engineering risk. Julian's mouth thinned. He thinks design is the part you can outsource to brightness and youth. Elena pictured her interns laughing with relief when lines met cleanly, not yet aware that miracle and tedium are cousins. Warn no one, she said. Not yet. Their choices are theirs. Our proof is ours. They moved from systems to rooms. In Nate's glass-walled office, the air smelled faintly of citrus and newness, as if the furniture believed in beginnings. Elena touched nothing. She simply looked and remembered how he had once sat on this very edge, feet braced on the floor, while she showed him a section cut, and he had listened with his whole face, as if comprehension were a sacrament. It was easier to hate the man he had become than to grieve the man who had made way for him. Julian lifted a folio from the credenza. Inside, the draft of a keynote address stained by a single coffee ring. The headline, Standing Beside Brilliance, the Invisible Work of the Public Partner. The sentences were good, too good not to have been read aloud to a mirror. In the margins, a note in Ava's precise hand. Lean the story toward care, not sacrifice. Make her a sun that tires you, not a storm that breaks you. Elegant, Elena said, and she meant the word as indictment. By mid-afternoon, the map was nearly complete. Receipts connected to rooms, connected to faces, connected to phrases that had conned their way into print. She and Julian sat on the low step at the end of the hall and looked at what they had drawn. a diagram of a collapse disguised as a plan. It was almost beautiful, the way rotten wood can be gorgeous under a microscope. Julian rubbed his eyes. "You should eat," he said. "So should you." They ordered soup that arrived in paper cups like small, forgiven mistakes. Elena ate slowly, savoring the heat as if temperature were proof of survival. Through the glass wall, the studio glowed with the indifferent loyalty of desks and lamps awaiting instructions. "We could leak this," Julian said finally. "Anonymous file. Let the internet do what it does. It would be quick." "Quick as a fall," she said. "I want stairs." She wiped the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "We anchor. We choose rooms where the room does the speaking." He nodded, chastened not by her authority, but by the future he could already almost see. "Zafira called," he added, producing a folded note from his pocket as if he were in a Victorian novel. "She said to tell you, when the enemy builds a myth, you don't shout facts, you shine light. People will discover the dust by themselves." Elena slipped the note into her planner. Light, then. She could trust light. Before they left, she returned to the server room one more time. She placed her palm against the cool, perforated door of a rack and closed her eyes. Beneath her skin, the faint thrum rose, a reminder that memory, when well kept, is a kind of electricity. She thought of her grandmother's clock, counting honestly, and of the bell jar over the wounded model. Structures could be made to fail gracefully. People, too. In the elevator, Julian leaned his head back and watched the numbers descend. "You always knew where the stress would go," he said. "You could feel it." "It tells you," she answered, "if you get quiet enough." Evening had begun to soften the avenue when they stepped outside. The air tasted of iron and something floral from a florist half a block down, the way resilience sometimes smells like cut stems. Elena walked with the measured pace of someone calibrating her own weight. In her bag, 2 hard drives nested like small, sleeping animals. On her phone, a map of appointments that would no longer be called by their old names. She paused at the curb and looked up. The crystal tower stood indifferent, its planes drinking light, returning it in altered form. She felt no urge to reclaim it, no wish to scratch her initials in its shadow. The work would stand or fail on the mathematics. Her task was a different proof, that a life could be recalculated without lying about its loads. A text arrived from Zafira. "The dome is aligned. Be in London by Thursday. Wear the dress that looks like an argument only you can win." Elena smiled, to herself, to the building, to the river somewhere repeating its lesson in patience, and crossed the street, carrying the evidence not like a weapon, but like a key. It began with a room that respected quiet. The interviewer, one of the rare journalists who asked questions as if he were restoring a fresco, arrived with a thin notebook and a fountain pen that did not leak. No entourage, no ring light. His first question was not about marriage, nor photographs, nor the price of forgiveness. He asked Elena about the angle at which glass ceases to glare and begins to glow. She answered with what light loves: proportion, patience, a tolerance for imperfection that makes perfection legible. The camera, small and humane, recorded a conversation about physics that looked like grace. When the article appeared 2 days later, it wore an unassuming title: Authorship, in Steel and Air, and contained not one romance except the romance of proof. Readers wrote to the editor to say they had not known that a beam could be a poem once it learned its mathematics. Zafira had arranged the sequence like a score. "No crescendos," she said, pinning note cards to a wall in her townhouse office. "We're writing adagios. We want the ear to lean closer." On the cards, lecture invitations Elena had ignored for years, a design journal's request for a piece on failure tolerances, 2 museums willing to host talks on structures that do not collapse, even when the people inside them do. Elena accepted 3. At her alma mater's auditorium, students fill the aisles with the hunger of people still unexhausted by the world. She spoke about fatigue, not as a human affliction, but as the phenomenon that haunts materials when forces ask too much, too long. She showed photographs of fractures beautiful as frost, the precise, terrible art of things breaking where they had been made too thin. "Design," she said, "is the mercy we give to what must carry weight." They applauded as if they had been granted permission to keep believing in difficulty. Afterward, a young woman with ink on her fingers asked, almost apologetically, how to claim credit in rooms that prefer myth to evidence. Elena considered and said, sign early, date everything, teach your drawings to testify. The next movement belonged to print. Elena wrote at her kitchen table in early light, coffee cooling, the river repeating its long sentence at the window. The essay refused melodrama. It described the unglamorous work of iteration, the comfort of erasers, the way invention often appears as correction. She titled it, On the Beauty of Load Paths, and submitted it to a journal that cares more for clarity than for names. They published it without a photograph. The paragraphs traveled farther than pictures would have. Engineers sent it to their mothers, and mothers wrote back, I understand you now. Meanwhile, the archive assembled by Julian and kept with priestly care began to move beneath the surface of the city's chatter. A curator planning the Glass and Light Gala called to confirm something she suddenly remembered. Elena's recommendations during the dome's turbulent restoration. A donor inquired whether a plaque's inscription could be amended. The gala chair, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes, requested a brief call, and then, in an uncharacteristic lapse, thanked Elena as if gratitude had caught her off balance. In between, there were small scenes with the temperament of hinge moments. A studio visit with a photographer who refused to pose her with tools she didn't use. He shot her instead in front of blank vellum, the page luminous as a promise. A radio program whose host blushed and said, on air, that his daughter had taped Elena's first sketches to her bedroom wall the way other children taped constellations. A breakfast with two city planners who had once preferred Nate's dinners to Elena's diagrams. They left with folded copies of On the Beauty of Load Paths in their coat pockets, the edges already softened by being read. The change did not roar, it accumulated. A profile about partnership at the top was quietly withdrawn before its layout reached the printers. The magazine declined to explain why. A client who had asked to reevaluate leadership sent an email whose subject line contained only one sentence. We were mistaken. The board member who had recommended stepping back from lectures requested tickets to the next one and pretended not to feel the irony clink against his teeth. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of thaw, Elena stood before a small audience at the Institute of Structural Aesthetics. 40 chairs, a clean lectern, a screen that behaved. Her talk, Failures That Teach Us to Stand, traced collapses that had changed regulations and, in changing them, saved lives. She spoke of a walkway that snapped because someone had listed bolts as if they were afterthoughts, of a roof that sighed into ruin because its designers had trusted the weather to keep old promises. She named no people and every principle. When she finished, an elderly engineer with a cane took her hand in both of his and whispered, "Thank you for speaking to the part of us that still wants to be good." After the lecture, Zafira led her to a quiet room and closed the door. "Proof and pattern have landed," she said. "Poise is doing the rest. Now a precision strike." She slid across the table a draft of the Gala program. 2 lines added since their call. Acknowledgement of technical counsel during restoration. E. Cruz. "It is insufficient," Zafira murmured, "but it is a beginning." Elena traced the letters with her gaze the way one reads a name on a headstone, aware of the life that should have been inscribed in full, grateful that there was ink at all. "We accept," she said. "We do not gloat." "Gloating is for people who need mirrors," Zafira said. "You have glass and sky." In the evenings, Elena returned to the studio with a discipline that tasted almost like softness. She worked on a small project no one had commissioned, a footbridge designed for a park that doesn't yet exist. In the drawing, the bridge curved, slight as breath, and required the courage of understatement to remain beautiful. She drew 2 figures crossing, tiny, anonymous, moving toward one another without hurry, as if the bridge were teaching them how to meet. Text from Mara punctuated the days with dry weather reports. Opposition counsel nervous. Offer adjusted from 50 to 35. Later, clients whispering about authorship rights. Whisper becomes policy. And finally, a message delivered with lawyerly economy. Discovery would be unkind to him. We have leverage. Elena did not celebrate. She made soup, called her mother, Listen to a long story about basil seeds that refused to accept their appointed season. She watered the lemon tree that had no business thriving in a New York apartment and admired its obstinate green. There were missteps. A columnist tried to reheat the old narrative by calling genius a cold climate. The piece skittered across screens and died, not because the world had grown fair, but because the world had grown bored of a myth that no longer entertained. A podcast host asked, sweetly, what it felt like to be difficult. Elena smiled and replied, "It feels like ensuring the roof stays up." The clip circulated for a day with captions that used the word satisfying. In a narrow, tender hour before sleep, she opened the fire safe and looked through her first sketches again. The messy, brilliant maps of thought that had not yet learned how to be polite. She slid into bed thinking of load paths and of people, how both required mercy at the corners where stress gathers. She slept the good sleep of a mind that had made fewer bargains with itself. On Thursday, a package arrived at the office without a return address. Inside lay a plaque, its brass cool and self-assured. The engraving was crisp, the font unassuming. Sky Dome, Structural Consultative Design, Elena Cruz. No letter, no apology, only the metal weight of memory corrected. Julian held it like a found star. "Do we mount it?" he asked. "We keep it," she said, placing the plaque on a shelf near the lemon tree. "And we proceed." The city adjusted itself by slight degrees. Invitations resumed, not the fevered kind that mistake proximity for allegiance, but deliberate ones from rooms where the work would be read correctly. At the end of a long day, Zafira called to confirm travel. "The Dome," she said, as if blessing a ship. "London will bring its chin up to meet you. Wear the dress that looks like a theorem." Elena stood at the window with the phone warm against her ear and watched the river earn its light from the last of the sun. It had taken a month to unteach the city a story it wanted to believe. It would take longer to teach it the truth. That was acceptable. Foundations are not hurried. She felt the new narrative settle, not like a victory, but like a level set true, bubbles stilled between marks, a promise to gravity kept. The email arrived at dawn, when the city still floated between its two breaths, the one that sighs out the night and the one that inhales the day. It came from Mara, brief as always. "Lauren wants to see you. Now." No subject line, no signature. Elena found Zafira waiting in the townhouse, already dressed in a black suit that looked as if it had invented the idea of understatement. On her desk lay a stack of papers, thin as accusation. "Something surfaced," Zafira said, sliding the first document across. "Our journalist friend dug a little too deeply into Miss LaRue's professional history and found the same fingerprints in 3 continents." Elena read. Each page contained a name, men in different cities, different industries, each one undone by a story that began in charm and ended in ruin. All of them had once called Ava their consultant, their muse, their necessary risk. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A startup dismantled after a funding scandal. A museum project where the benefactor's reputation had been scrubbed clean, only for a rival to emerge. A property magnate in Madrid whose empire dissolved under investigations just weeks after Ava disappeared from his calendar. "She doesn't love power," Zafira said quietly. "She feeds on proximity to it. She is the kind of strategist who prefers chaos to conquest. Chaos leaves more salvage." Elena turned the pages slowly, absorbing the texture of each name. And Nate? He was her latest structure. Zafira handed her the final sheet, an internal memo from a consultancy that had once employed Ava under another surname. LaRue was an invention of opportunity. The memo described her as instrumental in narrative reconstruction and asset redirection. There was nothing criminal. It was simply intentional. "She's been positioning him for a fall," Zafira continued. "Your husband thought he was being saved from your shadow, when in truth he was being excavated for parts. She's already approached one of your competitors with a proposal to restructure Hale and Cruz post-divorce. Their retainer reached her last week." Elena let the information settle in her chest like a new form of gravity. "He doesn't know." "No," Zafira said, "but he will. And it will look like betrayal, not karma, which is a pity because it's both." They sat in silence for a while. the city's light crawling across the walls. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was gentler than she intended. "She's dismantling him with the same elegance he once used to erase me." Saphira's eyes met hers. "That symmetry is the universe's idea of poetry. But poetry doesn't pay bills. The question is whether you'll watch or intervene." Elena shook her head slowly. "No, I won't touch it. Truth doesn't need my fingerprints." "Then let it unfold," Zafira said, closing the folder. "Our part is finished. The Gala will do the rest." In the days that followed, the revelation moved like smoke, unseen but sensed. The financial press whispered about concerns in Hale and Cruz's liquidity stream. Anonymous sources hinted at irregular transfers. The word embezzlement did not appear, but it hovered like the outline of a ghost that might, at any moment, choose to materialize. Elena said nothing. She prepared for London. At night, she reread her old notes, not to remember, but to measure distance. The tower she and Nate had built together now stood framed in scandal's half-light. Reporters began to ask questions that assumed her innocence, and she answered none of them. Silence had matured into her most persuasive language. Julian, loyal as a shadow, sent updates wrapped in brevity. "Clients moving to your name." Another, "He's liquidating. Fast." Each message landed with the weight of justice wearing ordinary shoes. On the flight to London, Elena looked out the window and watched the Atlantic turn from iron to pewter to light. She thought about Nate, how ambition had once been their shared dialect, and how it had become his native tongue. She could almost pity him now, ensnared by the woman who had studied his hungers the way an engineer studies stress points. In a folder on her lap lay the final set of documents Zafira had prepared. Talking points for the Gala, though no one would call them that. The remarks were architectural in rhythm, meant to be felt rather than quoted. At the top of the first page, Zafira had written in her tight, monastic hand, "You are not reclaiming the story. You are reminding it where it was born." Elena smiled faintly. She knew now what kind of vengeance she preferred, the quiet kind, built from truth and timing, balanced like an equation that solves itself. When she arrived in London, the city wore its gray like jewelry. The sky dome curved above her in dignified silence, its glass repaired by the calculations she'd once drafted alone on a sleepless night. There was no plaque then. There was one now. In the foyer, she met the Gala chair, who had once written to check in after the divorce scandal. The woman's smile faltered, reorganized itself, and held. "It's wonderful to have you here," she said. "We owe this building to your vision." Elena inclined her head. "You owe it to mathematics," she replied, and walked inside. The evening shimmered with orchestral restraint. Diamonds and opinions glowed under chandeliers that owed her their angles. Nate was already there, Ava at his arm, both radiant in their practiced ease. Cameras adored them, unaware that their story had begun to rot beneath the polish. When the host announced her name, there was a hush, a collective realization that the past had been invited to dinner. Elena walked to the podium, the hem of her black gown whispering against marble, the applause hesitant, confused, reverent. Her speech was brief. She spoke of resilience in architecture, of how materials that seem fragile can, under pressure, learn to remember their form. She did not mention names, yet every syllable carried the weight of an indictment written in marble and glass. As she stepped down, she caught Nate's gaze. His expression was the stillness between recognition and regret. Ava's hand, resting on his arm, tightened. Perhaps she felt the structure beginning to shift beneath her. Later, as Elena crossed the atrium, Zafira met her with a nod. "It's done," she murmured. "This morning, the competitor withdrew their offer. Someone leaked the memo about Ava's consulting history. She's already on a plane." Elena looked up at the glass dome she had saved. The light refracted in prisms, scattering itself into patterns no one could quite predict. "Then nature has restored balance," she said softly. Zafira smiled. "You make it sound like design." "Everything is design," Elena replied. "Even collapse, if it's elegant enough." That night, back in her hotel room, Elena stood before the mirror and unpinned her hair. The reflection looking back at her was neither triumphant nor broken. It was simply whole, as though wholeness had always been waiting behind every fracture. Outside, London's skyline burned faintly gold. In the glass, Her silhouette merged with it. A woman and a city, each rebuilt, each remembering that the truest strength is not resistance, but the grace of reconfiguration. Evening arrived with the ceremony of a curtain lifted by invisible hands. London wore its reign like silk, fine, luminous, unwilling to choose between blessing and veil. Carriages of light threaded the streets. The sky dome rose at their end like a held breath. Its glass seamed with mathematics. Elena knew the way a violinist knows the seam of a favorite string. Inside, the foyer glowed with a courtly restraint. Flowers the color of old pearls, a quartet unspooling Vivaldi as if time were an obedient animal. The kind of champagne that speaks first in fragrance. Elena paused beneath the oculus and felt the structure greet her. A subtle release at the base of the skull, as if the building, remembering, softened its posture. She had dressed like a theorem. Black satin cut along lucid lines. Nothing superfluous, every curve justified. Her hair was pinned in an elegant economy that made ornament irrelevant. She did not scan the crowd. Rooms disclosed themselves more fully to those who refused to hunt them. Yet the room noticed her. Whispers moved with the courtesy of a breeze. Her name curated into syllables of curiosity, recognition. A few quick apologies disguised as admiration. She accepted a glass, touched its rim without drinking, and walked the perimeter, letting the dome's acoustic hush steady the breath. Across the atrium, cameras flashed. Nate appeared first, then Ava, descending the marble steps with a choreography practiced for months. The tilt of a shoulder, the angle at which a cheek receives light. Their beauty had learned to perform sincerity. When Nate's gaze found Elena's, the practiced ease thinned. Recognition braided with something like hurt pride. Ava's smile held its shape, but her pupils tightened, small shutters adjusting to a less forgiving day. The host, a man whose voice had built its own real estate, took the podium as the quartet diminished to a courteous silence. He offered the usual courtesies, then surprised the room by setting the cards aside. "Before we begin," he said, "a correction long overdue. 3 years ago, when this dome faced an impatient gravity, a woman solved its problem. Tonight, in the house she kept standing, we acknowledge her." He lifted his hand toward Elena. "Ms. Elena Cruz." Applause doesn't always arrive honest. This did. It began with the engineers, those who know the smell of miracles when they're still wet, then grew outward as recognition reclaimed memory. Even the chandeliers seemed to glitter more precisely. Elena did bow. She inclined her head. "Thank you, I heard you," and felt the building's ribs answer, a resonance transmitted through steel and ceremony. When the clapping subsided, the host invited her to say a few words. She stepped to the lectern without haste. "I am grateful," she began, "not because my name is spoken, but because the building is listening." A small smile, the kind that forgives without granting innocence. Glass is not weakness. It is a covenant between light and restraint. When pressure arrives, and it always does, what holds is not spectacle, but the quiet math no one applauds. She rested her hand lightly on the wood. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about a room that keeps its promise." She left the stage to the kind of silence that dignifies speech. No one tried to stop her. The music resumed, altered by what it had just been asked to carry. Later, near the bar where bottles shone like benign conspirators, Nate approached. He came alone, as if his shadow had stayed behind to consider its options. Up close, he looked beautifully tired, the fatigue of a man who has practiced being himself too often. "Elena," he said, a name spoken as if it might absolve. "Nathaniel." She tasted each consonant, a scientist verifying a sample. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. "Which part?" Her tone was courteous inquiry. "Accepting gratitude that belonged to the work, or standing in the light you borrowed for years?" He opened his hands, a gesture learned in rooms where forgiveness is negotiated. "This isn't a battlefield." "No," she agreed, "it's a building. And buildings are honest. They stand or they don't." Ava arrived with the scent of something pale and expensive. "You're causing a scene," she said softly, though no one was watching. True scandal doesn't need an audience. Elena regarded her as one might regard a mirror that had chosen an unflattering truth. "Scenes cause themselves," she said. We only supply the lighting. Ava's mouth tilted. You're very sure of yourself. I'm sure of the math. Elena's gaze flicked, just once, to the dome above. It holds. Nate's jaw tightened. You always talk like that when you're hurt, and you always talk like this when you're cornered, she replied, and there was no heat in it. Only temperature noted, recorded, filed. A waiter glided past. Elena set her untouched glass on his tray. I will say one thing, she offered, not to wound but to unburden. The work would have cherished you if you had let it. It has room for more than one name. You mistook applause for proof and wondered why it stopped feeding you. He looked at her as a man looks at a door that is neither locked nor meant for him. I loved you, he said. It wasn't a plea. It was an inventory item that had misplaced its category. I loved the version of you that listened, she answered. I don't mourn him. He exists. He simply isn't here. Ava's hand came to rest on Nate's sleeve, proprietary, delicate. We should go, she said. Whether she meant from the conversation or from the evening was unclear. Elena inclined her head, granting them both a release neither had earned. Good night. She turned into the room, which was suddenly crowded with the correct people. Colleagues whose congratulations sounded like they remembered how effort feels. A young curator who asked for her notes on the restoration. A city councilor who confessed privately that plaques make amends only to metal. She answered with moderation, never rushing, never performing enthusiasm. Poise, as Zafira had promised, had begun to do its work. Zafira found her during the second aria, eyes bright with that particular satisfaction that never decays into glee. The competitor walked, she murmured. Your name is a lighthouse again, and our Ms. LaRue has discovered that private jets are less private than advertised. Elena did not smile. She let the information pass through her like light through clean glass. Then gravity is intact. They stood together beneath the oculus. Rain stitched its invisible seams on the glass. 1,000 soft collisions. Every drop a small insistence. It's strange, Elena said, half to herself. I thought tonight would taste like victory. It tastes like calibration. Better, Zafira said. Victories end. Calibration endures. Across the room, Nate and Ava were leaving. The cameras, fickle courtiers, tilted away a fraction too slowly. Ava's expression had the careful vacancy of someone rehearsing a disappearance. Nate paused at the threshold as if the building had placed a hand on his chest. For a moment his eyes sought Elena's, not for absolution, not even for understanding, only to confirm that the architecture of this night would remain exactly as it was, with or without his permission. Then he went. When the quartet began the final piece, the room settled into its last posture. Elena stood under the dome she had kept from falling, and felt the peculiar relief of seeing her work survive her presence. She was not triumphant. She was something rarer in a city addicted to spectacle, reconciled with the building, with the narrative that had returned to its rightful owner, with the version of herself that had learned to prefer structure to thunder. At the door, the night accepted her with the gentleness that follows storms that never quite formed. London's rain had grown finer, intimate, as if it had learned her name. She lifted her face to it and closed her eyes. Behind her, the sky dome held. Ahead, a street lamp cast a modest halo on wet pavement. Between them, a woman in a black dress walked as if the air had calibrated to her stride. The corridors behind the sky dome's bright rooms were lit in patient amber, the kind of light that forgives faces for what they have had to be. Elena stepped into that hush as one steps backstage to breathe. Velvet draperies held the sound of the gala like a cupped hand. Somewhere a mezzo practiced a line under her breath, the phrase turned to silk by repetition. Rain threaded the glass, soft as graphite. Nate found her there, away from the cameras and the curated astonishment. He came without an escort, as if risking being ordinary might yet rescue him. For a moment they only regarded each other across the carpet's muted geometry. Two people at the far edge of a map they had once drawn together. You meant to embarrass me, he said at last, the sentence steady enough to suggest he'd auditioned it. I meant to correct a caption, she replied. Embarrassment is a side effect of precision. He looked older than the hour before, not in the hair or skin, but in the way the eyes decide to measure themselves. They're talking, he said almost childishly. They were always going to, Elena answered. Tonight they have something useful to say. A door whispered, and Ava appeared, composed, immaculate, the rain having arranged her hair into something more expensive than water. She took in the tableau. Elena, at ease in the shadowed corridor. Nate with his hands half open. Herself on a threshold she had miscalculated. We shouldn't be here, she said, though her feet did not turn. Agreed, Elena said gently. But we are. Let's use the room correctly. Ava's smile tried bravery and nearly achieved it. You won, she said. Enjoy it in the appropriate places. This isn't winning, Elena said. It's accounting. She glanced at the storm stitched across the dome beyond. Debits. Credits. Wait where wait belongs. Nate drew a breath, the kind a man takes before declaring something he hopes will consecrate him. I didn't set out to hurt you. Hurt is a verb, but also a geometry, Elena replied. Sometimes you build toward it without reading the plans. She let silence travel the length of the corridor and back, collecting the last remnants of theater. When she spoke again, her voice took on the quiet cadence of instruction. You were offered a story that excused you from effort, a renewable alibi. It asked nothing except that you be central. You accepted. That is human. What is not forgivable is the theft you justified with it. Credit, funding, colleagues coached to unremember the hours they saw on my hands. Nate's mouth tightened. You make it sound like scheming. It was survival. Survival is a clean word for dirty work, Elena said. Look past it. Pattern is what matters. She turned to Ava then, not with triumph, but with a precise curiosity that had once saved a roof from falling. You understand patterns. It's why you seldom stay. The house collapses more beautifully without you inside. Ava's eyes flashed, honest at last. You think I ruined him. I think you measured him, Elena said, and found a way to harvest what he needed others to admire. God, Nate whispered, the syllable half prayer, half swear. You're both architects. Elena smiled, almost tender. No, I design so weight won't kill. She designs to watch where it lands. Ava's chin lifted. And you? You design to be worshipped. I design to be obsolete, Elena said. So the thing stands without me. She stepped closer, voice lowering into the intimacy of truth. Listen, this corridor is mercy. No cameras, no chorus. Take the exit with dignity while it's still yours to take. For whom? Ava asked, baffled by the absence of blade. For everyone, Elena answered. For the interns who shouldn't learn ambition from blood sport. For clients who deserve buildings rather than stories. For a city that will always prefer a stable roof to a clever scandal. Don't talk to me like a student, Ava said, but the edge softened. People do, sometimes, when their names are not asked for. Elena addressed Nate again. There will be filings you won't enjoy. There will be apologies you cannot afford. But there is also the work you could still do if you accept its scale. Sign what is fair. Credit what is true. Walk out of this corridor as a man who can bear his own weight. The quiet after that was not the quiet of surrender. It was the quiet in which a structure decides whether to keep standing. Nate looked toward the rain-silvered dome, and Elena could almost hear, in the machinery of his face, a set of gears catching at last. I used firm funds, he said low. Not much. Enough. I told myself it was the cost of being the face. Faces are cheap, Elena said. It's the bones that cost. And the testimonials, he went on, as if confession, when begun, preferred completion. I collected them. I told myself I was documenting balance. He managed a smile as inaccurate as a warped ruler. You would have made a better liar. I would have made a worse one, she said. That is the only reason I'm here. Ava took his arm. We don't have to stand here for this, she said. You owe her nothing. His hand, out of habit, almost covered hers, then didn't. He looked at Elena with the bewildered gratitude of a man permitted to stop performing. I owe, he stopped, unable to name it. You owe the beam, Elena supplied, and it was not sarcasm. Pay it forward in bolts. He laughed, a sound that had once been lithe and had learned to limp. You make mercy sound like math. It is, she said. A staff door opened at the far end of the corridor. Footmen came and went with trays like planets. The Gala breathed. The city arranged its next rumor. Elena felt no heat in her blood, no flavor of victory, only the surprising, durable relief of a calculation balanced. Ava drew a small, surgical breath. "Whatever happens," she said, "you'll always be cold." "Incorrect," Elena answered. "I am precise. Precision feels cold to people who have burned others to keep warm." For the first time, Ava looked young. Not the luxurious youth she wore like cloth, but the true species. Unarmored, unsure. She let go of Nate's sleeve. He reached for his cufflink, an old, nervous habit. Fingers failed at the clasp. He left it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the question was stripped of rhetoric. It had found the beam at last. "Return what isn't yours," Elena said. "Say what is. Stop borrowing weather." She inclined her head toward the rain. "It won't listen." He nodded once. Not promise, capacity. Then he said something that did not repair anything and did not try to. "I remember the night you solved the dome," he murmured. 3 in the morning. You cried without sound and said you were tired of being right. I didn't hold you. I called the chair. I wanted to be the voice that woke the city with good news. He looked at his hands as if they had been given the wrong assignment for years. "I'm sorry." Elena let the apology pass through her until it lost its performative heat and took on the temperature of use. "Thank you," she said simply. "Give it to the correct ledger." From the hall, a chord rose, the aria returning to its home. Elena stepped back into the light that had been designed to flatter and made no demands on the truth. Nate did not follow. Ava, after a moment of suspension, chose a different corridor entirely. Zafira was waiting near a column, having materialized with the courtesy of a well-timed thought. "Rewritten?" she asked mildly. "Rewritten," Elena said, "without publication." They walked together toward the atrium. Above them, the dome gathered rain and converted it to music against glass. The evening had noticed its own ending. People began to practice farewells in their throats. "What did you give him?" Zafira asked. "A corridor," Elena said, "and the price of using it." "And what did you take?" Elena considered. "My pronouns back," she said. "The ones that don't require an auxiliary verb." They reached the oculus. The city beyond shone, not with forgiveness but with work. Elena felt the building's calm lay itself along her spine. The confrontation, this time, had not been a performance, nor a punishment. It had been a recalibration. Weight redistributed, names returned to their owners, the future asked to show its math. "Shall we?" Zafira said, offering the smallest bow to the night. "We shall," Elena answered and stepped forward, the corridor behind her emptying of echoes, the room ahead opening like a solved equation. The conference room for the last negotiation had windows that opened, an eccentricity in a city allergic to fresh air. Morning came in like an uninvited witness, gilding the table's edges, finding dust no one else could see. A bowl of pears sat in the center, polished to an honesty fruit seldom achieves indoors. Elena took the seat facing east. Behind her, the skyline remembered her name without saying it. Mara arrived with her usual traveling altar, thin files arranged like a fan, 2 pens whose nibs bit elegantly, a square of linen folded until it resembled a decision. "We aren't here to win," she said, settling. "We're here to finish." Across the table, Nate entered without Claudine's choreography. He looked tired the way a house looks tired after the party, traceable, reparable. His new counsel, a quieter man with a talent for silence, sat down and opened a slim laptop, as though not to startle anyone. "No one reached for the pears," Mara began. "Our terms are unchanged." She spoke as if reading a blueprint that had already been built. 30% of liquid assets, no transfer of intellectual property, no ongoing royalties tied to designs authored by Miss Cruz. She turned a page. "Restitution of corporate funds used for non-business purposes, documented in our inventory. A neutral statement jointly issued to staff and clients. Mutual non-disparagement, limited to what civilized people owe one another." A pause, thin as gold leaf. "And full credit corrections where credit has been misapplied." Claudine would have argued the heir. The new lawyer cleared his throat and said, "We agree in principle." Nate folded his hands. 30, he repeated, as if tasting a temperature. His voice had mislaid its varnish. I can meet the restitution in 2 transfers. The statement, he glanced toward the window. I'll sign my name to accuracy. Elena watched his face hold and then release the smallest resistance, the way steel yields a fraction before learning its true strength. Accuracy is all I've asked, she said. He nodded. And authorship? He knew the answer. He asked it anyway, a ritual of letting go. Stays where it was born, Mara said gently, as law and gravity prefer. Clerical things were passed back and forth, schedules of payment, the language of explanation whittled down until it could not be misunderstood by anyone whose living depended on misunderstanding. Each clause found its place. Each signature prepared its hand. There remained the matter of the juniors he had courted in twilight. Nate spoke first. I'll rescind those offers, he said, privately, cleanly. He looked at Elena without pleading. Keep who wants to stay because the work asks them, not because I lured them with proximity. Proximity is a hunger, Elena said. Let them learn appetite. Mara, practical to the bone, slid across a final sheet, its font smaller, its consequences larger. Corrective credits, she explained. Projects, plaques, exhibition catalogs. Your name where your labor was, your name where it was not. We've prepared the list. The institutions have agreed to amend, Nate read. Some lines he accepted with the faint astonishment of a man discovering the ledger of an old neglect. When he reached the Sky Dome entry, his mouth twitched. You should have had this 3 years ago. Yes, Elena said, and the word did not seek consolation. But the dome stood. Some structures keep time until language catches up. They took a break while admin printed clean sets for signing. Elena walked to the window. The river moved with its austere patience. A tugboat shouldered a barge as if teaching effort to behave. In the glass, she saw Nate's reflection approach and stop at a courtesy of distance. I saw the plaque, he said. It weighs less than the moment, she answered. Do you? He hesitated. Do you ever wish we had been ordinary? She considered. Ordinariness had tempted her once, the way a park tempts a skyscraper. No, she said. I wish we had been kind. He made a sound that might have been agreement. For what it's worth, he murmured, I'll do the apologies properly. Not with press, with phone calls. Good, she said. Apologies are built, not posted. They returned to the table. The papers arrived, stark, ceremonial. Names waited beside the lines they had drawn in ink out of air and history. Elena's hand did not tremble. Her signature crossed the page with the authority of a beam laid true. Nate signed last. When he set the pen down, the room exhaled. No one clapped. The pairs sat gleaming, already irrelevant. Mara checked each page, smoothed them with the satisfaction of someone aligning a stack of truths. We'll file this afternoon, she said. Funds in escrow by Friday. The staff memo at close of business, the rest. She tapped the corrective credits, a ledger beautiful merely for being precise. We'll take time. Time is on our side. They shook hands without ornament. The new lawyer smiled at no one in particular, grateful to the god of completion. Nate hesitated, then extended his hand to Elena. She took it. Nothing passed through the contact but temperature and a very old civility. In the elevator, alone with Mara, Elena looked at her reflection dimly silvered in the doors. It feels less like victory than like removing a splinter you'd grown around, she said. Health often feels anticlimactic, Mara replied. You'll like it later. They stepped into a corridor that smelled faintly of lemon oil, the aroma of wood that receives care at intervals and remembers. Outside, the afternoon had decided itself into a soft and durable brightness. Elena walked toward it with the lightness of someone none of whose pockets contained secrets. At the studio, Julian met her with the alert joy of a messenger who has not run but has arrived. We're ready, he said, holding up the drafted staff memo like a small flag. She read it standing by the lemon tree. To the team, we have concluded the partnership. The work continues. Credits will be corrected. Authorship will be protected. The studio will remain what it has always wanted to be, a place where mathematics and mercy share a table. If you need steadiness, come to my desk. She initialed the bottom and handed it back. Send. The rest of the day arranged itself into blessed mundanity. An engineer called with a question about a thermal bridge. A museum in Tokyo asked whether she might be interested in a commission that used the word impossible with a mixture of superstition and hope. A student emailed a draft titled, "On the Ethics of Failure," shyly asking for comments. Elena wrote back in the margins with the patience of someone who had just chosen the long way and arrived. At dusk, she took the subway home, because sometimes victory is knowing you can, and stood, swaying among strangers. A child pointed at a poster for the Crystal Tower and announced to no one that it looked like a spaceship. The mother said, "A woman built that," and the statement fell into the car like a coin that lands heads up. In the apartment, the bell jar still sheltered the altered model. She lifted it, rearranged two broken braces until they formed a new symmetry. A small truth learned from damage. The plaque from London caught the last light on the shelf. The lemon tree exhaled a quiet green. Elena opened the window. Air came in, ordinary and clean, a climate with nothing to sell. Her phone chimed once, a transfer received. A second time, an email from Nate with the subject line, "Corrections sent." No attachments, no performance, only a sentence in the body. "Thank you for insisting on accuracy." And below it, a list of numbers that meant weight had returned to its rightful columns. Elena set the phone down and moved to the desk. She unrolled vellum and began to draw the small park bridge again, adjusting the curve by a degree, reducing, then reducing once more until the grace held without effort. On the margin she wrote, almost absent-mindedly, the first sentence she had permitted herself to write about the day. Some settlements don't divide, they return. Night arrived as a soft consent. The city kept standing, the room kept its promise, and at the center of both, a woman worked, unhurried now, having traded spectacle for structure, her future for a pen that did not leak, the long arithmetic of a life recalibrated until the numbers and the heart agreed. The morning after the settlement was so still that even the city seemed to hesitate before beginning its day. Elena woke before the sun, not from anxiety, but from a kind of brightness inside her chest, a calm, unfamiliar expansion that felt like space returning to its rightful owner. The window was open. London's air carried the scent of wet stone and magnolia, the kind of fragrance that belongs to endings disguised as beginnings. She rose without hurry. No court dates awaited, no interviews, no elaborate proofs to rescue from distortion. The fight had been concluded, not in victory's fever, but in precision's quiet arithmetic. The papers lay in a folder on her desk, signed and sealed, their edges squared like a promise kept to geometry itself. The studio opened slowly that morning, as if the walls too were adjusting to the absence of tension. Julian arrived first, carrying 2 coffees and an irreverent grin that belonged to youth unscarred by litigation. He set the cups down, surveyed the room, and said simply, "It feels lighter." "It is," Elena answered. "Buildings breathe better after a storm." They spent the morning reviewing drawings, new commissions, old revisions. Work resumed its rightful scale. No longer a refuge, no longer a battlefield. Only work, the honest labor of transforming weight into grace. At noon she stepped outside. The city greeted her without opinion. She walked through streets still rimmed with puddles, their reflections trembling under passing clouds. Every window pane seemed to remind her of something essential. That glass, fragile as it appears, endures precisely because it is allowed to flex. She reached the river, the same river that had witnessed her collapse, her reckoning, her return. The wind lifted her hair, played briefly with the papers she carried, and left them untouched. Across the water, cranes carved new silhouettes against the sky. She thought of the apprentices she had taught to measure load and tension, to understand that beauty without balance is only spectacle. Freedom, she realized, was not the absence of burden. It was the decision to carry only what mattered. In the weeks that followed, invitations returned, this time written in the ink of respect rather than curiosity. A university asked her to lecture on ethics in creation. A foundation wanted her design for a rehabilitation center. Nothing monumental, the chairwoman said, just a place where light helps people remember their bodies. Elena accepted. At night she began to write, not a manifesto, not a memoir, but a series of reflections she called The Architecture of Freedom. It was less about buildings than about the art of standing after collapse. She wrote, "Freedom is not the open sky, but the roof that does not own you. Freedom is the silence that follows truth, not the applause that follows noise. Freedom is remembering that surrender and strength are sometimes the same design, drawn from opposite directions." The words surprised her with their simplicity. For years she had measured her life in structures, beams, arcs, spans, and now she was building with sentences, the only material light enough to bear memory. Zafira read the draft weeks later and smiled in her usual minimal way. "You've turned survival into symmetry," she said. "Symmetry isn't perfection," Elena replied. "It's mercy." The book took a year to finish. By the time it was published, the city had changed again, as cities always do when their architects learn to love differently. The Sky Dome still stood, gleaming in all weather, and her name gleamed with it, not as possession, but as provenance. When the launch event came, Elena chose a small gallery instead of a ballroom. The walls held sketches from her early days, raw, unembellished lines, the kind that reveal ambition's hand before polish can disguise it. She read aloud to an audience of students, engineers, and strangers who had come because they recognized themselves in the promise of resilience. "Architecture," she said, "teaches us that every load is a conversation. The goal isn't to erase it, it's to understand how to carry it beautifully." She paused, and in that pause, the air itself seemed to listen. "We design bridges to meet across distance. We design homes so that breath feels safe inside. But the most complex architecture is the one we build within ourselves. It begins the moment we stop mistaking survival for purpose and start designing our own dimensions." When she finished, the applause rose softly, like rain against glass. For the first time, it didn't echo as validation. It sounded like gratitude, collective, quiet, shared. That night, Elena walked home alone through streets tender with fog. She passed the cafe where Nate had once met clients, the hotel where whispers had first turned to headlines, the courthouse steps that had stolen her sleep. They looked smaller now, scaled back to their proper size in the story. She did not stop. She simply acknowledged them, the way one nods to old scaffolding that has done its work. At the river again, she paused. The water moved beneath the bridges she designed, each span a conversation between necessity and trust. Above her, stars began their patient choreography, unbothered by human recalculations. Freedom, she thought, was not found in rebuilding what was lost. It was in allowing what had been lost to remain gone, and creating beauty anyway. She turned homeward, the book's proofs tucked beneath her arm, her reflection keeping pace in the glass of every darkened window. Behind her, the city kept its own rhythm, cranes shifting, ferries cutting clean lines, lights mapping constellations of human persistence. Before closing her door, she looked once more at the skyline, the buildings rising like voices, each one a testament to endurance refined into art. "Stand well," she whispered to them, to herself, to anyone listening, and to you, dear reader, to the one who has followed her through ruin and recalibration, through the architecture of failure and the grace of design. She would say this: begin building. Not walls to protect yourself, but spaces that allow air to pass freely. Not towers to prove your worth, but bridges that let others cross safely. Not monuments to the past, but shelters for whatever future has the courage to arrive. Because freedom is not the absence of structure. It is the mastery of your own design. So build, carefully, tenderly, relentlessly, until your life too becomes a cathedral of balance, held aloft by nothing but truth and light.